The noon sun hung mercilessly over the town like a white-hot brand pressed against the earth. Heat shimmered above the dust, blurring the crooked outlines of buildings, and every plank of wood seemed to groan under its weight. A hawk circled, slow and silent overhead, watching the spectacle gather below. The crowd swelled in front of a crude platform hammered together from warped lumber. Boots scuffed the dirt, spurs jingled, bottles clinked. Men reeking of whiskey and smoke leaned, shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in a chorus of laughter and hunger. The smell of sweat and dust and horse manure was thick enough to taste. On that platform, lined like cattle, stood women, some with hair matted from days of confinement, some hollow-eyed, their bodies swaying like reeds in the wind. The auctioneer, a thin man with a smile sharp as a knife, moved down the line, tugging at arms, lifting chins as if he were choosing fruit at a market. Each gesture drew a roar of appraisal from the crowd. A girl with a crooked smile went for $10. Another, silent and shivering, fetched $7. Coins clattered into greedy hands. The air buzzed with the cruel excitement of men who believed they owned the earth and anything walking on it. Then the mood shifted. She was led forward, shuffling barefoot, a burlap sack tied over her head with coarse rope. Her wrists were bound, skin rubbed raw where the fibers dug in, her shoulders bent as though carrying a lifetime of weight. The crowd erupted in jeers and cruel jokes. Hell, she ain't even got a face. Someone barked, spitting into the dirt. "Sell her by the pound!" Another cackled. The auctioneer grinned wider, milking the cruelty. "Gentlemen, here she is, the mystery prize. She could be a beauty, she could be a beast. But I promise you this, she's flesh and blood, and she'll work as long as you keep breath in her lungs. Now, who'll start me off?" Silence followed. Not eager silence, the kind that dripped with disgust. Heads shook, laughter rolled, men stepped. Back as if she were diseased, no one wanted what they could not see, and then a voice broke through. $2. It wasn't loud, but it carried. The crowd turned. At the edge of the gathering stood Elias Harrow, a lumberjack by trade, though his trade had marked him deeper than he knew. His hands were cracked, the nails dark with sap, his shoulders broad, from years swinging an axe into stubborn pine. His beard was black, streaked with gray, his face weathered like stone carved by bitter winds. He stood alone as he always had, a man shaped by solitude. The crowd roared with laughter. $2! For that? Cheaper than a mule. The auctioneer chuckled nervously, waiting for a higher bid. None came. No one wanted her. The woman with the sack remained faceless, nameless, a ghost no man desired. "Sold," the auctioneer barked, slamming his hand against the post. $2 to the lumberjack. A handful of coins clinked into the man's palm, swallowed by his pocket. Chains unfastened, rope tugged. She stumbled, nearly falling, but caught herself with the stubborn dignity of one who had already fallen too many times before. Elias stepped forward. His shadow fell across her like the outline of a mountain. For a moment, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade, the laughter, the curses, the flies buzzing over spilled liquor. It was just him and her and the brutal midday sun. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Name for the bill, mister?" The question hung in the heat. The crowd waited, jeering, smirking. The sack shifted. Beneath it came a sound, faint, trembling, muffled by cloth but sharp enough to carve silence into the air. Marisol. The name was a whisper, but it sliced through the noise like a blade through rope. The laughter died. The crowd hushed. Elias stood still, his jaw tightening. He had not expected her to speak. That name, soft and foreign, struck something in him he couldn't name. It felt like a prayer spoken over a grave, like the sound of water in a desert. Marisol. He gave a small nod, more to himself than to anyone else. "Marisol," he said aloud, his voice rough as gravel. "That's her name." The auctioneer scribbled it down with a crooked grin, eager to be done. The crowd began to disperse, their cruel amusement already turning to boredom. But Elias remained, staring at the woman before him, faceless still beneath the sack, trembling in the shadow of men who had laughed at her misery. $2 had bought her. But that single word, her name, had bought something else entirely. The wind rose, sweeping dust across the emptying square. The hawk circled once more overhead, silent witness to the bargain struck. And so began the uneasy bond of a lumberjack and the woman called Marisol, born from shame, bound by something neither yet understood. The wagon creaked like an old bone as Elias heaved the woman up onto it. The boards groaned under her weight, though she was light, far too light, like someone carved hollow by hunger. The burlap sack still swallowed her face, tied cruelly at the base of her throat. Her wrists bore angry red bands where rope had rubbed the skin raw. Elias's knife flashed once, sharp and quiet, cutting her binds. Her arms dropped to her lap like dead branches. She did not thank him, did not speak, only drew them close, as if every part of her body had to be kept guarded. Elias climbed onto the bench. With a crack of reins, the old mule lurched forward, hooves kicking dust into the burning air. The prairie stretched before them, endless and bone-dry, the horizon blurred by heat waves that shimmered like ghosts. Vultures circled high, their shadows gliding across the ground. Every creak of the wagon, every groan of leather harness echoed loud in the silence between man and woman. Elias glanced sideways once. The sack remained, breathing slow, deliberate. She did not move, save for the faintest shudder of her chest. Silence suited him. He had lived with it so long it had become companion and curse both. But this silence felt different, heavy, alive. It pressed down like the weight of a storm yet to break. As the mule pulled them across the barren miles, memories crept into him, unbidden. He saw a boy kneeling in dirt, his hands small and desperate, piling stones over a shallow grave. His mother's hair still clung to the air, the faint smell of pine soap that had clung to her skirts. He had buried her himself, while his father drank inside. He saw that same father years later, face red and swollen from whiskey, eyes empty as hollow knots in a log. A man who had once swung an axe with strength, reduced to stumbling rage. Elias had walked away from him, away from the town that whispered his name like a curse, and into the woods. There he stayed, chopping trees and splitting logs, carving out a life no one cared to notice. Alone. Always alone. The mule snorted, dragging him back to the present. The woman with the sack sat rigid, silent, her presence foreign and sharp against his world of wood and solitude. By nightfall, he pulled the wagon off the road, stopping by a copse of twisted pines. He made camp with practiced hands, kindling, caught, flames licked, sparks drifted upward like tiny spirits. The smell of burning resin mingled with the dry night air. Coyotes yipped far off, their cries floating like warnings. Elias chewed jerky by the fire, tearing it with teeth dulled by years of work. He set a strip on a tin plate, slid it toward her. For a moment, she did not move. Then slowly, she took it, lifting it beneath the sack. He heard the faintest sound of teeth on tough meat, each chew stiff and cautious. The fire popped. Shadows danced on the trunks. Elias stared into the flames, his axe resting near his knee, blade glinting red in the light. At last he reached over. The knot of the sack rasped under his fingers as he loosened it. He pulled the burlap away, her face emerged, and the firelight revealed the truth of her silence. Bruises darkened her cheekbones, a split traced her lip, and her eyes, sharp, black, defiant, burned like coals refusing to die. She did not flinch under his gaze. She did not bow her head as the others had. Instead, she met his eyes, unblinking, unafraid, as though daring him to see her fully. For the first time in years, Elias felt words struggle against his throat. None came. She ate little, said less. But her silence was not weakness. It was steel. It was survival. The fire shrank low. The prairie wind carried the dry rattle of grass. Then she spoke, quiet but clear, each word edged with dread. "They'll come for me." The sound of her voice struck him like the crack of thunder. It was not pleading. It was not warning. It was prophecy. Elias turned his eyes to the darkness beyond the fire. Every shadow seemed alive, every cry of coyote sharpened with menace. His hand drifted to the axe, fingers curling around the worn wood of its handle. The flames hissed as a knot of resin burst, scattering sparks into the night sky. The woman sat motionless, her dark eyes reflecting the fire. And Elias sat beside her, watching the black beyond the pines, his chest heavy with something he could not yet name. Her words lingered, heavy as storm clouds. "They'll come for me," and the night answered with silence. The cabin crouched at the edge of the pines, rough-hewn logs darkened by weather and smoke. It was not much. 4 walls, a stone hearth, a roof patched with tar and stubbornness, but it stood, and in that lonely stretch of country, standing was enough. Snow dusted the ground in the mornings, thin white crust crunching under boots, and the air smelled of resin, of pine pitch and smoke carried on the wind. Elias rose before dawn, as always, his hands steady with work. He split wood, mended tools, set snares in the brush. Marisol moved within the cabin like a shadow, sweeping, tending the fire, hauling water with arms too thin for the weight but unyielding all the same. She worked in silence, her every gesture graceful yet brittle, as if she were carved from glass that might shatter if touched. Elias never pressed her with words. He had none to waste, and hers seemed locked deep behind those dark eyes. His silence, where others had filled her ears with commands and curses, became something else entirely. A kind of respect. But the silence could not hide the scars. On her wrists, pale ridges where rope had burned too deep. On her shoulders, faint welts that the firelight sometimes revealed. When she bent by the hearth, the fabric of her dress shifted and showed the thin, cruel lines carved across her back. Each mark told stories Elias did not need to hear aloud, to understand. At night, those stories broke loose. She woke with sharp cries, muttering words in Spanish, her chest heaving, her hands clutching tight to her ribs as if to hold herself together. Sometimes she curled into the corner of the bed frame, rocking, whispering prayers Elias could not follow. Sometimes she simply screamed until her voice cracked and bled into sobs. He never touched her, never tried to rouse her with hand or voice. Instead, he sat by the fire, his shadow stretched long on the cabin wall, waiting until the storm inside her passed. Only when silence returned and her breathing grew steadier did he allow himself to sleep. Through fragments, broken words, gasped confessions in half-dream, he pieced together the path that had brought her. A village burned, kin scattered like leaves before a storm, men who traded her body as if it were a coin. Each time she told pieces, she shook her head, as though ashamed of being broken, as though survival itself was sin. Elias listened, always listened, and when she fell silent, he said nothing. He knew there were weights too heavy for words. One evening, with the snow beginning to drift heavier through the trees, he sat at the small table carving. His knife moved with slow patience, shaving curls of pine from a block of wood. The lamplight threw a golden glow across his rough hands, across the wood grain he coaxed into shape. Marisol drifted near, quiet as always, her steps soft against the floor. She reached out and touched the carving, her fingertips tracing the grooves, following the rings of the tree locked in the wood. Her voice came low, almost reverent. Wood remembers where it stood. Elias lifted his eyes. For a long moment, they held each other's gaze, unspoken truths trembling in the air between them like a taut string. She did not smile. He did not speak. But something passed between them, fragile and alive, a thing neither dared name. Outside, the wind moaned, through the pines. The days fell into rhythm, work, silence, the fragile peace of two souls circling each other like wary wolves. But peace has a way of breaking when least expected. It came with the thunder of hooves. At dawn, while frost still silvered the grass, the sound shattered the stillness. Horses pounding down the trail, voices cutting sharp through the trees. Elias's head snapped up. The axe in his hands, meant for splitting logs, suddenly felt like a weapon again. Marisol froze, a pan slipping from her grasp, clattering against the floor. Her face drained of color, eyes wide with terror. She pressed herself against the wall, trembling, every breath quick and shallow. Through the thin wood walls came voices. Rough, searching. Marisol, one called, stretching her name into a cruel echo. We know you're here, another jeered. Elias's jaw tightened. His hand gripped the axe handle until his knuckles whitened. His heart hammered, not with fear for himself, but with something heavier, sharper, an understanding that what he had thought was purchase, what he had thought was 2 coins spent at auction, was now something else entirely. They wanted to take her, and he could not let them. Marisol's breath shuddered, her lips moving soundlessly in prayer. Elias stepped closer to the door, the axe heavy in his grip, his shadow cast long by the morning light spilling through the cracks. Outside, the hoofbeats circled, men's laughter carrying like smoke. The world had awakened. They had come to claim what Elias thought he had bought, what he now knew he must protect. The sound of horses broke the morning frost. Not distant now, close. The cabin walls trembled with their approach, hooves striking the frozen ground like drums of war. Elias stepped out into the pale light, axe in hand, the cold biting his lungs. They came through the pines, 3 riders, at first, then a 4th straggling behind. Rough men, their faces leathered by sun and sin. Coats stiff with dust, revolvers at their hips, eyes gleaming with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. One spat into the snow. That's her, ain't it? Another leaned forward in his saddle, grinning, yellow teeth flashing. We heard she was hid up here. Girl from the borderlands. Man paid $2 for her like a fool. But she ain't his to keep. She's property. The fire. Word cut sharp. Property. Elias planted his boots in the snow. He said nothing. Instead, he lifted his axe, set the blade deep into a log beside him. The crack echoed through the clearing, sharp as a gunshot. His hand rested on the handle. His silence spoke louder than threats. The men shifted uneasily. Silence, in a man like him, was not weakness. It was promise. The leader sneered, spitting. Again. Step aside, logger. We ain't here for you. Hand her over, and maybe you keep your hide. Elias's eyes narrowed, his breath steaming in the frigid air. He gave no ground. The silence broke with the click of a revolver. Tension snapped. The first man swung down from his horse, reaching for the cabin door. Elias moved like a bear roused from winter. Sudden, unstoppable. His axe swung free of the log, wood chips bursting as he ripped it loose. The blade cleaved through the air, burying itself in the man's shoulder with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, collapsing into the snow. Blood sprayed hot against the white, steam rising in the cold. The others shouted, guns scraping from their holsters. Elias roared, charging into them. The axe became an extension of his rage, his years of solitude, his pain made steel. One pistol. Fired wild, the shot tearing bark from a pine. Elias swung low, the blade catching a leg, splitting bone. The man toppled, shrieking, hands clawing at the red churn beneath him. Snow became mud, blood soaking deep into the earth. The third came at him, knife flashing. Elias blocked with the haft of the axe, wood splintering. He shoved forward, head, slamming into the man's face, breaking his nose with a crunch. The knife clattered into the snow, Elias grabbed it, turned it, and drove it into the man's throat. Hot blood poured over his hands. The fourth rider cursed, firing twice into the air before yanking his horse around. His voice cracked with fury as he fled down the trail. "We'll be back, Harrow. You're dead, you hear? Dead!" Then there was only silence. The silence of wind in the trees. The silence of men dying, their bodies twitching as steam rose from wounds into the frozen air. Elias's chest heaved, breath ragged. His arms trembled. The words cracked something in the air between them, a truth spoken without armor. That night, they sat by the fire. The bodies outside already dragged into the trees, left for wolves and crows. The flames painted Marisol's face in gold and shadow, her eyes shining with the reflection of heat and memory. For the first time, she spoke more than fragments. Her voice trembled, but the words came, one after another, like wounds reopening. "They came to my village. Riders. They burned. It burned everything. My father, my brothers, gone in fire. My mother taken. I never saw her again. Me." She broke, clutching her knees. "Me they traded, from one man to another. My body for their coin, like cattle, like nothing." Her voice faltered. The silence returned, but not empty this time, heavy with grief. Elias listened. He said nothing. His eyes stayed on her, steady, unblinking, though his beard hid the wetness gathering at his lashes. His chest ached with fury, with sorrow, with something he had no word for. When she finally stopped, when her voice fell into exhausted silence, he reached for another log, set it gently on the fire. Sparks rose, flaring against the dark. The fragile thread between them tightened, blood and fire binding them closer than words could. And outside, the pines whispered in the wind, carrying the promise of more to come. Winter clamped its jaws around the pines. Each morning, snow fell like ash from a sky the color of slate, coating the ground in silence. The air bit sharp, cutting through wool and skin, turning every breath into a ghost drifting away. Elias rose early as always, swinging his axe into stubborn logs until his muscles burned, the steady thud of blade against wood echoing like a heartbeat through the clearing. Marisol moved inside, tending the fire, mending seams with fingers reddened from the cold. Their days carried few words. None were needed. The silence between them had changed, no longer a wall, but a space where something unspoken lived. It hummed, quiet and insistent, like the low moan of the wind through the eaves. Small things spoke louder than language. Elias built her a chair, rough at first, then shaped with care. He carved roses along the arms, each petal patient, his knife coaxing beauty from grain. When he set it before her, awkward as a boy, she ran her hand over the grooves, her eyes softening with something he couldn't name. She, in turn, worked a scarf of coarse wool. Her stitches were uneven, her thread scarce, but she wove until her fingers bled. She placed it around his neck one evening without a word. The wool scratched, but he wore it as if it were silk. In that frozen cabin, affection bloomed like a fragile flower pushing through frost, yet storms raged inside them both. Elias dreamed of graves, coffins sinking into cold earth, his mother's hair damp with pine needles, his father's face slack in death's grip. He woke with sweat freezing on his brow, his chest heaving, his hands reaching for an axe that could not cut memory. Marisol fought storms of her own. Some days she stared at her reflection in the icy washbasin, her fingers touching her scars, as if they were chains still binding her. She spoke little of what had been done to her, but the silence carried shame like a shroud. One night, as wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, she broke. They sat near the hearth, firelight painting, their faces in gold and shadow. Elias whittled as he often did, shaving curls of pine from a block. Marisol sat across, her arms wrapped tight around herself, eyes fixed on the flames. Suddenly, her voice cracked the air. They took everything from me. Her words were jagged, torn from deep inside. My family, my name, my body. I am nothing. Her voice wavered, then steadied, as if confessing to a judge. I am unclean. I am ruined. Her hands trembled, gripping her dress as though she could tear the shame from her own flesh. The fire hissed, resin snapping. Elias set down the knife. Slowly he lifted his gaze, his eyes dark as storm clouds. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, rough as the winter wind clawing the cabin walls. You are more than breath. She blinked, startled, the words halting her. More than pain. More than what they took. His voice broke, but he forced it on. You are still here. The silence after was thick, alive. Tears slid down her cheeks, not with sobs, but quiet, steady as though the truth of his words loosened a weight she had carried too long. And then it happened. The thing both had feared, both had needed. She rose, slowly, as if moving against the pull of the storm outside. He stood too, towering, uncertain. For a heartbeat they hovered, two broken souls in a fragile truce. Then she pressed herself into him. Their first embrace was not gentle. It was desperate, trembling, bodies colliding like waves against rock. Her hands clutched his back, as if she might drown without him. His arms wrapped her tight, his face buried in her hair, the scent of smoke and wool filling his lungs. The fire roared, shadows leaping wild across the cabin walls. Outside, the storm screamed, snow lashing the windows, wind clawing like a beast, denied its prey. They held each other, as if the world itself forbade it, as if to love was rebellion against the cruelty that had shaped them both. Their hearts pounded, not with the rhythm of fear, but with something fiercer, something defiant. Her lips trembled against his chest. His breath shook against her hair. Neither spoke. Words would have broken it. For that night, there was no auction block, no hunters, no ghosts of fire and chains. There was only warmth in the storm, two bodies clinging like lifelines. But even as they stood locked together, the wind's howl carried a warning. Peace, like winter fire, could burn bright, but it burned fragile. And somewhere beyond the pines, beyond the snow, danger gathered, waiting to strike. The night bled fire into the snow. They came as shadows first, dark figures threading through the pines, torches flaring against the storm. Horses stamped and snorted, steam curling from their nostrils. Wolves circled at the tree line, eyes glowing, waiting for scraps of man and fate alike. Elias stood in the clearing, axe in hand, breath rising like smoke. The scarf Marisol had woven hung about his neck, stiff with frost. Behind him the cabin glowed faint with lamplight, Marisol's figure silhouetted at the window. They had come back. More this time, twice as many. Guns gleaming cold in their fists. The leader's voice cut through the storm. You can't keep her, logger. You can't keep what ain't yours. Elias said nothing. His silence was an iron wall. He only lifted the axe, its blade catching the torchlight, and set his boots firm in the snow. Marisol stepped out beside him. She carried no weapon, only a lantern, her eyes wide yet steady. The wind whipped her hair wild, snow clinging to her, lashes. She whispered, almost to herself, If this is our last night, let it burn bright. Then the torches surged forward. Gunfire cracked, shattering the silence, sparks bursting from the cabin walls. Elias roared, a sound deeper than rage, older than words. He charged into them, axe swinging, each blow fueled by years of solitude, of loss, of a love too late found. The first man fell with his skull split, snow spraying red. Another's chest caved beneath the axe haft, bones snapping like dry kindling. Bullets ripped the air, one grazing Elias's arm, another tearing through his coat. Still he pressed on, a storm-given flesh. The pines echoed with chaos, Wolves howling, men cursing, the crack of rifles and the wet thud of steel in flesh. Snow churned beneath boots, no longer white but smeared crimson. Elias fought like a man, who had nothing left to lose. For each man that struck him down, he rose again, breaking their line with the feral strength of a bear cornered. But even storms break. A shot rang out close, too close. Elias staggered, blood blooming bright against the snow. Another shot tore through his side. He dropped to one knee, the axe. "I don't love skin." His breath rattled, each word a struggle. "I love what breathes under it." Her tears fell hot onto his face. She pressed her forehead to his, clutching his hand as it slipped from hers. And then he was still. The storm howled above them, carrying his spirit into the pines. Months passed. Winter thawed into spring, though grief lingered heavy in the clearing. Marisol moved through the days with quiet strength, her belly swelling with new life. She buried Elias beneath the pines, roses planted over the mound, their thorns sharp, their petals red as the blood he had spilled. She sat by that grave often, speaking softly to the earth. "He gave me a name back," she would whisper. "He gave me breath." When her child came, she held him against her breast, his cries thin, but fierce, his tiny fists clenched as if already ready to fight the world. She named him Harrow, years unspooled like thread. The boy grew tall, shoulders broad, his eyes the same pale fire as his father's. The sound of axe against wood returned to the clearing, steady and sure, each thud echoing the rhythm Elias had once set. Marisol watched from the doorway, silver streaking her dark hair, her hands folded around the scarf she had woven long ago. Sometimes, when the wind swept through the pines, carrying the scent of resin and the hiss of needles, she closed her eyes and whispered his name like a hymn, Elias. The boy swung the axe again, wood splitting clean, the sound sharp against the hush of the forest. A rhythm passed down, not by words, not by blood alone, but by sacrifice, by love that had burned bright against the storm. And in that clearing, beneath the pines, beneath the roses blooming red as memory, Elias Harrow endured, not in flesh, but in legacy.